Throughout history, humans have worn armour because it's obviously the sensible thing to do when people are trying to use things like spears, axes, swords and arrows to kill you, because it massively increases your survivability. So therefore, animals used in war must have worn armour as well, didn't they? Well, we know that horses and elephants certainly did, but what about dogs? Did warhounds wear armour? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, I often make videos about armour, like this helmet here, which I'm going to take off now. And one of the questions that's come up a few times in the last couple of months when I've been making videos about human armour is, what about dog armour? Now, if you look on the internet, you can find all sorts of modern dog armour, which is made by armour aficionados. Indeed, you can even find fantasy art of warhounds wearing armour. You can even find cat and mouse armour. Yes, I kid you not, you can find it. But does this have any historical basis whatsoever? Did dogs actually wear armour historically? Well, believe it or not, this isn't actually a very straightforward thing to answer. And I don't have a complete answer for you right now, but I have a partial answer for you. So the answer is, kind of. Right, first up, we have to discuss the issue of warhounds. Were dogs used in war? Well, yes, they were, but maybe not in all the ways that Hollywood or fantasy might have us believe. So we know absolutely people like the Romans did use dogs in war, the Egyptians did as well. In the medieval period, dogs were sometimes used in some form of kind of wartime capacity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were used as attack animals. They certainly weren't ridden like horses. Now, just before I go on, I want to mention that we do absolutely have armour for horses and armour for elephants. So technically, people could have made armour for dogs. There's no reason why they couldn't, and perhaps they did. We're going to see some examples here. But fundamentally, I think the whole question is coloured from our modern minds by the idea of this sort of hellhound kind of charging into battle and taking down enemies. And the fact is that most dogs used in war across the centuries have been used not so much in a battle context, but more in a guarding context. So mastiffs, for example, were commonly used to guard houses in civilian life, and therefore mastiffs were used to guard things like wagons and valuables when on campaign. So dogs would have accompanied soldiers, but weren't necessarily used in battle lines. Now, one rare exception is the type of dogs used by the Spanish in the conquest of southern Mesoamerica. And there were certain types of large attack dogs which were indeed used to terrorize indigenous peoples when raiding villages and such like in the Americas, and we're going to come back to them in a bit. But first of all, I want to talk about ancient world and medieval dogs, generally speaking, were used in hunting. And that is actually where we do see some sorts of armour used. So when you start looking up genuine, corroborated historical examples of dog armour, we have to say from the outset, the absolute most common type of armour to encounter is a collar, a dog collar. It's as simple as that, and many of our dogs still wear collars to this day. Now, if you go into a pet store to buy a collar for your dog, you'll find one option is a leather collar with spikes on it. Have you ever wondered where that comes from? It comes from hunting. And quite simply, these collars, sometimes leather with spikes, sometimes leather with fabric over the top and spikes, and sometimes just made of interlocking bars, so completely metallic with no leather involved, so chain essentially, with spikes on, were actually really prevalent in the ancient and medieval and Renaissance worlds, and in fact later up until the 19th century, for hunting certain types of dangerous beasts, wild beasts, and guarding as well. So bear in mind that a lot of dogs obviously were used for guarding flocks and herds. But in hunting, the most common types of creatures that we see these armoured collars used to protect the dog against are boars, wolves, and to some degree stags and bears. Okay, so these large dangerous creatures which were massively hunted in the medieval world, and in many cases, like in England, hunted to extinction. That's why we don't have bears and wolves anymore here. Dogs were vulnerable when they were attacking something like a bear or a wolf or a boar indeed, to their throats being taken out. And this is a weak point on a dog. So the first thing they did was they armoured up the throats. And of course, against a biting animal like a wolf or a bear, having spikes around the neck gives them a huge advantage in taking on these types of creatures. So armoured, or should we say spiked collars, were undoubtedly the most common form of dog armour, if we want to call it that, throughout history, across continents and time. Now at this point you might wonder, well, was dog armour, like proper armour, even a thing? Is it just complete fantasy? Well, it turns out it actually was a thing. So as you see here in this medieval example, and there are other examples like this, you can see what's essentially a cuirass, or cuirass as it should be pronounced. In other words, a leather, possibly with plates involved, and it could have things like mail, chainmail involved as well. But essentially it's a torso defence that also covers the neck as well. So really you could kind of view it as an expanded version of the collar. Now, one of the most common, it seems anyway, looking at the historical artwork, most common uses for these was against boars, because of course boars have tusks which rake upwards and cut upwards indiscriminately into the sides and chests of animals that might be attacking them, or they might be attacking. And so obviously having essentially armour on the torso of your dog hugely increases its survivability. And remember that many of these dogs were either beloved companions or really valuable because they were highly trained, they were bred, highly prized, they were expensive commodities, just like a horse or a falcon. So absolutely, cuirasses were a thing in the medieval period for dogs for hunting. Now, does that mean that they could have also been used in war like that? Well, yes, it does, but we don't really have much, or perhaps even any evidence for it. But nevertheless, it is dog armour. Now, looking around for other dog armours, you do come across some dubious provenance and probably faked in the 19th century armours intended for dogs, which I'm not gonna look at here because I haven't found any reliable examples. However, if you go to the Royal Armoury in Madrid, you will find a proper, historically provenanced, legitimate, as you would imagine, practically fantasy suit of armour for a dog. Now, not only is this genuine armour like you might have imagined at the beginning of this video, but this was made by none other than Desiderius Helmschmied of the famous Helmschmied armouring dynasty from Germany, and it was made between 1530 and 1540, that's estimated, so we're talking about the first half of the 16th century. And he's an armourer, so the Helmschmied family are making armour from the 15th century onwards for some of the highest nobility of Europe. And this is a genuine, bona fide armourer making an armour for a dog. Now, as you can see on this armour, it has essentially a cuirass to protect the sides and the back of the animal. It also has a headpiece, very like a chevron for a horse. In fact, it's pretty much based on a horse version. And then it has mail down the neck. Now, this armour is very much, in my opinion, based on the armour that's designed for horses. So obviously horses had been armoured going all the way back. In fact, probably the earliest examples were in the 12th century with just mail, aka chainmail. And then we start to get plates being used in the 14th century. First of all, the head defence and the chest defence. But later on, particularly probably at the end of the 14th, but certainly in the 15th century, we start to get what's sometimes referred to as barding in modern sources, protecting the sides and flanks of the horse as well. So really kind of like a tank. And this armour made by Desiderius Helmschmied, incidentally for Charles V. So it was made for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and has ended up in the Royal Armoury in Madrid. Due to various, how the dynasties were related. So this is a German armourer, but it's ended up in Spain. But this armour is very clearly based on horse armour, just adapted to a dog. And this is incredibly high status. It's been etched, it's got gilding on it. It's really up there at the top of the armourer's art of the 16th century. So while this is very high status, the question I guess is, so in the 16th century, were they regularly armouring dogs? And I think the answer is no. The problem is there isn't very much evidence for it. There's a little bit. In fact, there's a late 15th century and early 16th century artist called Alert du Hamel, who is kind of associated with Hieronymus Bosch. And so he does a lot of fantastical, essentially fantasy scenes. And there is this armoured dog shown here, which is an example of a dog in war armour. But again, This armour doesn't necessarily look very practical, especially with those tassets hanging down at the side over the rear legs there. And my impression is this is quite fantastical and possibly not something that was actually real. But nevertheless, we have something there from the late 15th, early 16th century that is sort of imagining a dog armour. Now, in fact, you might wonder at this point, well, what about other parts of the world? And we do have this alleged Japanese dog armour that was sold in auction. And again, I can't testify to the genuineness of this. I have looked around for other Japanese dog armours and haven't really turned up very much. So was this just a one-off? Was it a bit of fun? Is it genuine? I can't really say at this point. So to conclude, were dogs used in war? Yes, they were, but maybe not in the way that you thought, with the only real exception being those dogs used by the Spanish in America, in the Americas, in the conquest of the South and Mesoamericas. However, there's very little evidence that those dogs wore armour, although possibly they did, and some sources say they do, but I need to do more research on that. Did armour exist for dogs? Yes, 100% it did. However, it was primarily for hunting. Okay, and even the Royal Armoury example in Madrid, it's probable that that armour is primarily for hunting dangerous creatures like boars or perhaps bears, rather than for war. Okay, so there's lots of interconnected things here, but did dog armour exist? 100% it absolutely did. It's just that it was probably mostly used for hunting. Anyway, this is a subject which I'm sure I can do more research on and maybe dig down deeper and find some more examples from art, or perhaps even surviving pieces if they're out there to be found. If you know of any that I haven't featured here, then by all means get posting down below and maybe we can revisit this topic in the future. Anyway, I hope you're subscribed. Please check you are, and give us a like, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.